Hello and welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video. My name is Jonathan M.S. Pearce and I'm going to talk to you today about slavery and slavery in the context of biblical scholarship. So it's slavery and the Bible, but not in terms of what you might think as in, does the Bible countenance slavery? What kind of slavery was included in the Bible, and sort of what rules were there dictated by God or by people in the Bible concerning slavery. That is not the scope of what I'm going to be talking about, because I'm going to be concentrating on a book by a biblical academic, or the late scholar Hector Aavlos. And he wrote a book, Slavery, Abolitionism and the Ethics of Biblical Scholarship. And the nature of this book is to look into the claim, as a project, this was looking at the claim that Christian biblical scholarship and the Bible and Christianity as a whole was largely responsible or necessary for the abolition of slavery. So abolitionism is itself dependent upon, Christianity. And so Hector Aavlos looks at that claim and says, absolute rubbish. Or at least that's what I think he's going to say, because I'm going to be going through this book, with you chapter by chapter. Today I'm just going to be concentrating on the introduction. But the idea is that this is a look at how biblical scholarship informed or didn't the abolition of slavery. As it took place throughout the Western world in the last sort of 300 years or so. The book is really good so far. I've only read sort of the introduction, chapter 1, so the way my brain works is I have to read it and take notes and then, give you that information. Otherwise, the further I get on, the more I'll forget the stuff I've done before. That's my MS brain, so I do apologise about that. But so where does Hector Aavlos start in the book? Well, he starts off by talking about how biblical scholars, whether secular or Christian, have a presupposition about Jesus that is quite problematic in terms of being able to objectively analyse what Jesus said and what the Bible said that Jesus said, and what kind of person he was. So, for example, when you look at someone like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, you don't start off with a preconceived conclusion about who they were, particularly, the sort of claim that they were perfect, right? So you go and say, right, we're going to do loads of research. I might have a preconceived ideal about who they are, but let's see through this research whether that can hold up, and we'll look at the nuances of their character and of the claims about them, so on and so forth. What Hector Aavlos starts off by saying in the introduction to this is that biblical scholars have a very different approach to Jesus, and this is arguably really quite problematic. And I thought this was something quite interesting in terms of the sort of presuppositions that are applied to Jesus, and by extension God, when attempting to do scholarship about Jesus and about the history of Jesus. So what Aavlos says on page 1 in the introduction is, and quote, "My project actually began with a puzzling experience. If one reads almost any book on Christian ethics written by academic biblical scholars, one finds something extremely peculiar. Jesus never does anything wrong. Rudolf Schnackenberg's The Moral Teaching of the New Testament represents the view one usually encounters," and he quotes from that book. "The early church, and with it Christianity, throughout the centuries was profoundly convinced that the greatest of Jesus' achievements in the moral sphere was the promulgation of the chief commandment of love of God and one's neighbour, the message of Christian agape, the model and highest expression of which is the mission of the Son of God to redeem the sinful human race, brought something new into the world, an idea and reality so vast and incomprehensible as to be the highest revelation of God and quite inconceivable apart from revelation. End quote. And Aavlos continues, the rest of the book finds nothing but praise for Jesus and not a whit of criticism. And the idea that if you're going to try and really grapple with these big ideas and see both what Christians say, but also what Christ supposedly says, and what the biblical authors said, then it's something of a problem if you're going to start this project with the incontrovertible conclusion that Jesus is perfect, is morally sublime, and you can't touch him, because then you end up doing all sorts of biblical hermeneutics, which are interpretative methods. You do all sorts of interpretations in order to maintain that conclusion. And it means that all that biblical scholarship does is fudge the claims about slavery in order to maintain this supposed truth that Jesus is morally perfect. And that's broadly one of the main things that gets in the way of, you know, decent scholarship in this sphere, and that Hector Aavlos takes aim at. So you know, that's a good place to start out. That, you know, traditionally scholars do not entertain the idea that God might have a dark side. Yeah. As Aavlos states on page 2 and 3, the answer, of course, the question he asks is, he says that Jesus should have flaws, right, as a historical being like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. So how is it that most academic biblical scholars never see anything that Jesus does as wrong or evil? And he answers, the answer, of course, is that most biblical scholars, whether in secular academia or in seminaries, still see Jesus as divine and not as a human being with faults. Such scholars are still studying Jesus through the confessional lenses of Nicaea or Chalcedon, rather than through a historical approach we would use with other human beings. In fact, Luke Timothy Johnson, a well-known New Testament scholar at Emory University, remarks, we can go further and state that the basic historical claims of the Nicene Creed are well supported. Quote, he was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. Close quote. In essence, what the most universally used Christian creed asserts about the human person, Jesus, is historically verifiable. So it's like, right, we're starting off, and you kind of understand that because these are Christians generally. We're starting off with like the truth of the Bible. And then we're going to start looking at the claims with that already cemented at the forefront of our mind, and that will colour the approach that we take towards how we interpret the Bible, and that's really problematic and not least thoroughly circular. And he quotes Norman Whybray, a noted biblical scholar, who understands that there is a bit of an issue here. And this is a quote from Whybray, from one of his books or papers. The dark side of God is a subject that has received astonishingly little attention from Old Testament scholars. This is Aavlos's point. The standard Old Testament theologies, monographs about the Old Testament doctrine of God, articles about particular passages, even commentaries, are almost silent on the matter. Even those that make reference to them have tended to play down such passages or sought to explain them away with a variety of arguments. And this is precisely what Aavlos then starts looking at in the chapters that go forth after the introduction, which is exactly that. How are they dealing with these problematic biblical excerpts? Is it a case of reinterpretation? Is it a case of just ignoring them? Is it a case of X and Y? And it appears to be a case of all of the above. Let me continue. Which is to say, what is the main argument of the book? Hector Aavlos sets us out in the introduction, as you would expect, basic elements of the argument. And he says, this is page 4, despite the thoroughly benign manner in which biblical ethics are often represented, the Bible endorses horrific ideas and practices. Obviously, that's something that Christians will definitely contest. The Bible doesn't endorse horrific ideas and practices, surely. Aavlos says, yes, it does. And one of these horrific practices is slavery. So one of the most tragic and vicious institutions ever devised by humanity. For about 1,900 of the last 2,000 years of Christian history, it was self-described Christians who kept slavery, in some form or another, a viable institution. Yet many modern historians and biblical scholars still claim that the Bible was a main factor in abolition. So this is the main bone of contention for him. It's the idea that Christianity was, like I said earlier, was the main determining component, variable, in the abolition of slavery. And yet he's saying, no, it's not. It was what was used to justify slavery for 1,900 of those 2,000 years. And I liken this to this sort of analogy, which is, you know, Christians are patting themselves on the back in the same way that you might pat yourself on the back if you saved Jimmy from drowning. You pull Jimmy out of the river, you save him from drowning, you say, oh, well done me. If it wasn't for me, you would have drowned. But forgetting that you pushed Jimmy in to the river and held Jimmy's head down under the water until he almost drowned, and then pulled him up and got him out of the river and saved him. So the idea that you should, you know, clap yourself on the back and congratulate yourself for saving Jimmy ignores a rather important point, that you were responsible for making him fall in the river and almost drown. Well, you were responsible for holding his head under the water in the first place. So it's a really bizarre scenario, and that, I think, is pretty analogous to what Christians do, which is, well done Christians, Christian abolitionists. It was all because they were Christian that they stopped abolition, and forgetting the fact that it was Christians who were using the Bible to countenance slavery in the first place, and have better rationale using the Bible to do so. And that's the controversial, or even more controversial point that Christians attempt to contest, and the way that they contest that is what Aavlos looks at. But he sets out his argument. So there are three elements to his argument. First element is biblical scholarship generally functions as an apology for biblical views now deemed unethical, and slavery is a primary example. So that's that biblical scholarship functions to justify unsavoury ideas. 2. Reliance on biblical ethics generally has delayed the abolition of slavery and any progress toward freedom in the manner the latter is currently conceived. So second part of the argument. So first part is that, you know, biblical scholarship is an apology for unethical ideas, and 2, it's delayed bad ideas being remedied. So it delayed the abolition of slavery. And 3, any credit to the Bible for ethical advances concerning freedom is usually the result of arbitrary exegesis of the Bible, reinterpretation, and the abandonment of biblical principles. So that third part is to say that Christianity and Christians and Christian scholarship is the idea that it should be congratulated for advancing abolitionism is really problematic, because the exegesis that is used to do that is contradictory, sort of uses double standards, and we'll come on to look at this, and reinterpretation, and actually abandons biblical principles that are very clearly set out in the Bible. So those are the three elements to what Aavlos is going to set out in the book, and then he goes on to just throw in a few examples of how actual modern moral in post-Enlightenment thinking has been enshrined within, say, the UN Charter or the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if you look at Article 4, it says, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. So, these are this kind of secular ethical systems and rules that we're happy to enshrine in our law. Article 21.1 of the Universal Declaration embodies another concept, which is everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. I shall demonstrate, and this is Aavlos talking, I shall demonstrate that the bulk of such principles are owed to Greece and Rome more than to the Bible. So the idea that these, and you get this a lot within Christianity, that these kind of secular ideals are standing on the shoulders of the Bible, of biblical thinking and biblical ethics. And actually Aavlos will contest that and say, I presume, and say that actually it's really standing on the shoulder of Greek and Roman thoughts more than biblical ethical thinking. So obviously, if we're going to be discussing slavery, as Aavlos will be, then he needs to set out what the definition of slavery is. And he talks about a number of different definitions or excerpts, a number of different definitions in the book. These are from pages 6 and 7. So this is David Bryan Davis, who from Yale University, who wrote The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. And he summarised some of the definitions as follows. Quote, in general, it has been said that a slave has 3 defining characteristics. His person is the property of another man, his will is subject to his owner's authority, and his labour or services are obtained through coercion. So 3 elements there, and that they seem pretty sound as far as not sound as ideas, obviously, but sound as a definition for slavery. Legal definitions routinely emphasize the property aspect of slavery. In Alabama, there was a formal legal definition of slavery as follows. So this was Alabama law. The state or condition of Negro or African slavery is established by law in this state, conferring on the master property in and the right to the time, labour and services of the slave, and to enforce obedience on the part of the slave to all his lawful commands. The 1926 Slavery Convention, more formally known as the Convention to Suppress the Slave Trade and Slavery, was issued under the auspices, this is Aavlos talking now, of the League of Nations. That convention defines slavery as, this is another definition, the status or condition of a person over whom any or all powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. And the Universal Declaration of 1948 is succinct and absolutist. So this is another quote. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. And then there are other definitions, but I'll just go to the last section where he talks about definitions of slavery. Aavlos, who says, yet Thomas Morris, so this is another thinker, I'll have to go back and see exactly who Thomas Morris was, is correct in remarking that, quote, the slave as property is central to any consideration of the relationship between slavery and law. Aavlos says, for my purposes, slavery, this is in italics, so this is important to him. Slavery is a socio-economic system centering on the use of forced labourers who are viewed as property or as under the control of their superiors for whatever term was determined by their masters or by their society. So this definition encompasses modern and ancient situations. Within a broader social context, slavery means that human beings could be abducted from their families and be subjected to the most cruel and horrible treatment. Any mercy was completely at the discretion of the master or the broader society to which the master belonged. And I think that fairly well sums up a pretty good definition of slavery that will suffice for us to use as a foundation to the claims that we make, because these will broadly be the claims that Aavlos makes, because this is reading through Aavlos's book, or certainly picking out the main points for you. So it's like a book club we're having here, or something. So what Aavlos says is that there are broadly two approaches to biblical scholarship when dealing with slavery. The first approach is to ignore the problem. The second approach is Christian apologetics. And when we look at ignoring the problem, he points out, and he says the most common approach is the second approach to do Christian apologetics. But he says, there are some really pretty stark examples of ignoring the problem. He says, Waldemar Janssen's Old Testament Ethics, a paradigmatic approach. So as a book dealing with Old Testament ethics, does not bear a single indexed reference to slavery. Same applies to noted books on ethics by John Barton and Gordon J. Wenham. I think I've got a book on Christian ethics by Wenham. The authoritative Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible has no entry for slavery in the New Testament in its first edition. Separate articles on slavery in the Old Testament and New Testament were included in the later supplement. So the New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible does have an entry on slavery by J. Albert Harrell, who comes to some conclusions similar to mine, but without elaboration. So, over time, these sort of books have been forced to kind of add supplementary pieces on slavery that were just missing, or are still missing. But the far more common approach is the apologetic approach. And what you generally get with the apologetic approach is a descriptive statement about slavery followed by an adversative conjunction to mitigate that statement and hope it does a job. So I think I'll explain to you what that means. It basically says it means that so much of apologetics appears to be, yeah, this was fairly bad, but this was fairly bad, however, blah, 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 and leads you on that. This is a very positive bit at the end. So you get the descriptive part and then the adversative conjunction, but, however, whatever, that says, yeah, it's bad, but, the old classic, I'm not racist, but, it's like reverse of that, isn't it? So, this is a very common apologetic approach, and he gives some examples of that. So this first example of that sort of approach is from Leon Epstein, who says, what was the book? Social Justice in the Ancient Near East and the People of the Bible, from 1986. He says, as for the Israelites, they can have foreign slaves in perpetuity. However, we should recall that even the Covenant Code prescribes the immediate liberation of male and female slaves if their master puts out an eye or breaks a tooth. So that's nice. It is clear that the protection of slaves that the Torah seeks to assure is very adequate, but on the whole, the Jewish law was much in advance of other legislation in antiquity. So it was bad, but it was better than it was before. Okay. So there's a problem there that needs unpicking, but this general approach is it was bad, but is really common as Aavlos goes on to talk about. This is from Isaac Mendelssohn's influential book Slavery in the Ancient Near East. So Aavlos says, 1949 book, Aavlos says, the book tried to show that the Bible represented a great advance over other systems of slavery among Israel's neighbours. Really common, the kind of like part of this trajectory and saying, look, this bit here, that's Christianity is responsible for that, and all of this improvement here is responsible, is only able to happen because of this Christian bit here. And we'll talk about how problematic that approach is later. We'll talk about in the next chapter. But it's the describing this not very good stuff and then saying, but it's better than it was before. So here Mendelssohn's conclusion is that, quote, this denial of the right of possession of man by man in perpetuity is as yet restricted to Hebrews only. But it is a step which no other religion had taken before. Blah, blah, blah. But, blah, blah. So you see, as a part of this incremental change, rather than God coming down and saying, don't keep slaves. Slaves are bad. Slavery is bad. And you have a step change. And then you can say Christianity, qua God, is responsible for the abolition of slavery because God came down and said, don't do it. Right? There you go. Rather than just a moral trajectory of which Christianity is a part of that trajectory, and then isolating Christianity and saying, it's Christianity what did it. It wouldn't have happened without Christianity. And that's thoroughly problematic. And he talks about another author, Ephraim Isaac. So when discussing the curse of slavery imposed on the Canaanites, Ephraim Isaac says that, in quote, in spite of the slurs, insults and denigrating remarks that are heaped upon the Canaanites in biblical and rabbinic literature, there is no explicit or implicit denial of their human dignity and their equality with Israelites as human beings. So that bit's really important. There is no explicit or implicit denial of Canaanites' human dignity and their equality with Israelites as human beings. And as Aavlos goes on to say, Isaac leaves unexplained how biblical commands to kill and enslave Canaanites uphold their equality and human dignity. This is the unbelievable claim that the Bible doesn't say that Canaanites aren't human equals and don't have human dignity. It's not either implicitly or explicitly said otherwise. Hang on. The Bible countenances killing them and enslaving them. See exactly what it does. You couldn't be more wrong. And so we start getting, Aavlos starts moving on to seeing how different people apologise for slavery in different contexts. So you get the biblical academia, but you also get popular literature, people like Rodney Stark, the famous sociologist of religion, who has also written history books about how Christianity flourished and why it flourished from a demographic, sociological point of view. And they are seen by skeptics like myself as thoroughly controversial, not very good, thorough accounts of the scenario. And then people like Dinesh D'Souza and other sort of popular writers who say, Christianity is responsible for the abolition of slavery. And actually what Aavlos is doing with this project is disabusing people of the notion that Christianity is indeed the primary determining component of abolition, slavery abolition. So, Aavlos says here on page 11, Rodney Stark's impressive publishing record in this study of American religion has catapulted him into being a spokesperson in areas of history in which he has done very little primary research. Moreover, according to Stark, quote, slavery did not die of its own inefficiency and emancipation was not a capitalist ploy. Moral fervour is the fundamental topic of this entire book. The potent capacity of monotheism and especially Christianity to activate extraordinary episodes that have shaped Western civilization. So he's saying that monotheism and especially Christianity has activated extraordinary episodes that have shaped Western civilization in terms of abolishing slavery. It's the moral fervour of Christianity what did it. And that's what Rodney Stark says. Dinesh D'Souza's What's So Great About Christianity glorified the role of Christianity in abolishing slavery. And it's these claims that are made by so many Christians, these are what Aavlos is taking aim at. He says, he goes on to say, page 12, Aavlos, within the current guild of biblical scholars, Harrell, who wrote an important article on slavery for the authoritative New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible that we mentioned earlier, I think this is one that was added in, acknowledges a problem that abolitionists have when using the Bible. This is totally key here. And this is a quote from Harrell. In the late 19th century conflict over the Bible and slavery, American abolitionists, many of whom were Christian evangelicals, many evangelicals were abolitionists, ransacked scripture for texts condemning slavery. Okay, well, that's fine. But found few. There's your problem. As a consequence, they developed new hermeneutical strategies to read the Bible to counter the plain sense, literalist reading of pro-slavery theology. Most embarrassing for today's readers of the Bible, the pro-slavery clergymen, there was a huge number of clergymen who were pro-slavery, were holding the more defensible position from the perspective of historical criticism. The passages in the Bible about slavery signal the acceptance of an ancient model of civilization for which patriarchy and subjugation were not merely desirable, but essential. Whoa, this is actually a really, really big admission here. It's saying, one, that there were a bunch of pro-slavery clergymen and who were fighting to defend slavery. Two, that when the religious evangelicals were against slavery, they ransacked the Bible looking for quotes, but couldn't find many to support their position against slavery. And that indeed those pro-slavery clergymen actually had a more defensible position given the Bible as a resource, as a foundation of their beliefs. And this is really problematic. An example that Aavlos gives of the sort of fights between pro-slavery clergymen and abolitionist ones, he says, in the 19th century, the pro-slavery Presbyterian clergyman Fred A. Ross, 1796 to 1883, ridiculed the manner in which Albert Barnes, 1798 to 1870, an abolitionist minister, used the Bible. So you've got these anti-slavery people trying to take quotes from the Bible, but it's quite a difficult thing to do because the Bible appears to support slavery. And so you've got pro-slavery clergymen taking the mickey out of these abolitionists. And this is a quote from Ross. "You get nothing by torturing the English version. People understand English. Nay, you get little by applying the rack of Hebrew and Greek, even before a tribunal of men like you, who proclaim that Moses in Hebrew and Paul in Greek must condemn slavery because, quote, it is in violation of the first sentiments of the Declaration of Independence. You find it difficult to persuade men that Moses and Paul were moved by the Holy Ghost to sanction the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson." He's basically saying stop retrojecting like the Declaration of Independence and these Enlightenment philosophies back into the Bible, mate, because it ain't there. And that this is a Christian saying that. It ain't there because this is pro-slavery. Yay, slavery. So Ross would say. And Aavlos goes on to say, David B. Davis, another major scholar of slavery, allows for Christianity as a factor, albeit not a decisive one. Quote, "I would still maintain that hostility to slavery, largely religious and philosophical in origin, had little chance of having any practical effect until it became incorporated into the political culture of the British governing elite." So, we're now, as we come towards the end of the introduction, you'll be happy to know, Aavlos is talking about what were the reasons for slavery being abolished. And he said there are you get Marxist scholars talking about it's capitalism actually that was either responsible for slavery, and then when it was not so capitalistically attractive, that's what led towards the abolition. I know that's been challenged more recently. And you got this chap here saying that it wouldn't have happened if the British elite hadn't taken it on, and it had become sort of a philosophy or an idea that was really popular within the liberal elites of the time. And Aavlos goes on page 15 to say, perhaps no scholar is more celebrated for removing credit from Christianity than Eric Williams, author of Capitalism and Slavery, who asserted that capitalism, not Christianity, was a major factor in the final abolition of slavery. Again, as I say, and Aavlos says that that might not be completely correct. It is being attacked, but it's a multifaceted situation. But he goes back to talk about Rodney Stark, who is known for his work on American sociology of religion, has responded vigorously to explanations that do not see Christianity as essential to abolitionism. So he's like desperate for Christianity to be the main source of abolition. As Stark phrases it, quote, just as science arose only once, so too did effective moral opposition to slavery. Christian theology was essential to both. So you wouldn't have got science and you wouldn't have got slavery abolition if it wasn't for Christianity. That's basically what Stark is saying. And I'm broadly going to leave it there because that's essentially what the book then contends with and contests. So he finishes the introduction, does Aavlos, saying, in fact, it demonstrates that it was abandoning or marginalising biblical argumentation and shifting to secularised economic, humanitarian, legal and practical arguments that made a much greater impact on abolition than Christianity. So those are the reasons why abolition happened, not it's Christianity what did it. Anyway, that's the introduction. That should set up where we're going to go, and I'll do a video on chapter 2. The introduction is kind of chapter 1. The next chapter. But hopefully this is interesting for you. Get the book. It's really great. I like it a lot. And I'm interested to see where it goes. But if you can't afford the book, then here's my video to help you along the way in understanding the discipline of biblical scholarship and how it apologizes for slavery and how abolition arose. Anyway, that's the introduction. Check out my writing at Only Sky. Details are below. And if you are kind enough to donate to help me keep doing this, then there are PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee links just below, and always really, really gratefully received. But anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Take care. As ever, question everything, particularly yourselves.